talk about that later, but...
It ain't no but.
And they heard everybody around you. They just not up enough to tell you.
Did you have an effect on my mental health?
Yes, and I love you.
How my mom conned us into doing it was she said, think of it as a commercial for the store. My mom knew Ryan, and Ryan would like come over for dinners, and he's like, you guys are nuts. We need to film this.
Yeah.
Kanye West screamed at Kris Jenner during a tense conversation about...
You've probably seen the clip by now, but the strange part is how differently it feels when you watch it after the document started surfacing. Kanye West is standing in a room with Kris Jenner, the red MAGA hat pulled low, his voice cutting through the air while she breaks down in front of him. And all he keeps repeating is, it does matter. Across the table, Corey Gamble sits almost motionless, not interrupting, not calming the room, just observing as if the whole moment has already moved beyond a family argument and into something much bigger. Back then, the internet treated it like another public unraveling, another chaotic scene people could laugh at, clip up, and move past before the next scandal arrived.
Kanye West screamed at Kris Jenner during a tense conversation about...
But with every new filing, every sworn statement, and every carefully worded denial, that old video starts to look less like noise and more like a warning nobody wanted to examine too closely. And that is where the mood changes, because this story is not really about celebrity gossip anymore. It is about legal papers, public allegation, family members contradicting each other, and people being dismissed as unreliable the second their version becomes uncomfortable. In April 2026, Ray J filed documents claiming Kris Jenner personally helped turn Kim's private controversy into a calculated business arrangement, then allegedly supported a legal narrative designed to make the situation appear very different from what he says actually happened.
I think we opened maybe 2004 or 5.
The show was 2007.
Yeah, but we started, I think, doing the deal in 2006. But at first we were like, we're not doing this. And how my mom conned us into doing it was she said, think of it as a commercial for the store. My mom knew Ryan, and Ryan would like come over for dinners, and he's like, you guys are nuts. We need to film this.
Yeah.
And of course, my mom was foaming at the mouth, her and Kim, and I think they thought it was gonna just like maybe be about them, or I don't know what they thought, but we just started filming, and it just, every single one of us plays a big role, and it just sort of happened.
Around the same time, Khloe Kardashian appeared on camera and admitted, in her own words, that their mother had misled them to get the family on television, a statement that landed differently because it came from inside the house, not from a critic outside the gates. And then there is Kanye, the former husband who spent 8 years close enough to the machine to see its quiet rooms, its private conversations, and the pressure points the public never gets to touch. He reportedly hired a military intelligence professional to look into whether the family's empire had deeper connections to disturbing behind-the-scenes circles, a move that sounded extreme until people began comparing it with the claims now entering the public record. Maybe he was spiraling, maybe he was seeing patterns where others saw chaos, but the question that refuses to disappear is simple. Why are so many pieces beginning to point back toward the same locked door? And once that door becomes the center of the story, the old footage no longer plays like a random outburst. It feels like the first loose thread in a much colder pattern. What if the most revealing moments don't come from accusations, but from the brief, almost casual confessions people weren't supposed to analyze this closely? The conversation shifts the second you hear Khloe Kardashian speak about the origin of keeping up with the Kardashians, not as a grand opportunity, but as something far smaller, something that, according to her, was framed as a simple promotional push for their clothing store.
By the way, North, you need to have some, loyalty. When mommy talks about people, you cannot tell them. Why would you tell Angie Kendall I hated her outfit?
Kim was telling me all night, she's like, no, it's great, your look is great, I love it. And then North and Penelope were in my room after, and I go, oh guys, who was your favorite of the night? Then they were like, you were actually our favorite. And I was like, oh my God, stop, really? And they were like, yeah, we really loved yours, you were our favorite. And I was like, your mom said she really liked my look too. And she goes, she was lying, she told me she did not like your look.
Sitting across from Morgan Stewart in April 2026, she describes how Kris Jenner presented the idea to her, Kim Kardashian, and Kourtney Kardashian as nothing more than a commercial. Limited, controlled, and temporary. But the reality that followed stretched across 20 seasons, migrated onto Hulu, and built a global brand ecosystem, while the very store it was meant to spotlight quietly disappeared, almost like it had served its purpose and then faded out of relevance. That contrast alone creates an uneasy gap between expectation and outcome, one that feels too wide to ignore once you sit with it long enough. Because if the foundation of something so massive began with a version of the truth that wasn't entirely complete, it raises a different kind of question, not loud, not dramatic, but persistent. Online, especially across forums and short-form clips, people didn't just react, they started connecting, tracing a line from that early decision to later controversies that never fully settled in the public mind. And while no single statement proves anything on its own, the pattern people think they see becomes harder to dismiss the more often it repeats. That's where the conversation drifts toward the 2007 situation involving Ray J and the distribution handled by Vivid Entertainment. A story long understood one way, now being revisited through a different lens. The official narrative has remained steady for years, but as new claims surface in legal context, the tone around it subtly changes. Not confirmed, not resolved, just unsettled. And when multiple timelines begin to overlap in ways they didn't before, it leaves behind a quiet but uncomfortable thought. Maybe the beginning of this story holds more weight than anyone realized at the time. What if the version of events everyone accepted for years was never meant to be questioned this deeply until one person decided to stop playing along? For nearly 2 decades, the story surrounding Vivid Entertainment followed a familiar arc. Legal action was taken, a settlement was reached, and somehow, from that controversy, Kim Kardashian emerged as one of the most recognizable figures on the planet. It felt almost too clean, too perfectly structured, like a narrative that had already been finalized before the public even had time to process it. But then, in November 2025, Ray J filed a countersuit, and instead of vague denials or general pushback, he laid out a version so detailed that it forced people to stop scrolling and actually read. He claimed that Kris Jenner personally introduced him to Stephen Hirsch back in 2007, describing a meeting that, according to him, set everything into motion long before the public ever heard a word about it. And then came the part that shifted the tone entirely. His allegation that all parties agreed to stage a lawsuit, creating the impression of a leak without consent, while privately understanding exactly how it would unfold. That single claim didn't just challenge the timeline, it reframed the entire situation into something far more calculated, at least from his perspective. But here's where the situation becomes even harder to follow in a straight line, because the response didn't come quietly. In October 2025, Kim and Kris filed a defamation suit against Ray J, pushing back against his public statements, especially after he made comparisons and used legal terminology that raised eyebrows across media coverage. It looked at first like a standard attempt to shut down claims before they spread further, but then an unexpected detail surfaced. On April 17, 2026, TMZ reported that a confidential settlement had already been reached in 2023, totaling $6 million, structured in a way that suggested ongoing efforts to keep certain details from becoming public. That revelation alone shifted the conversation because it introduced a timeline running parallel to everything else people thought they understood. And when Ray J continued speaking despite that agreement, the situation escalated again, with Kim and Kris seeking to recover $7 million, including penalties tied to the alleged breach. Yet on April 1st, 2026, a Los Angeles judge denied that request, a decision that didn't resolve anything, but instead left both narratives standing side by side, each pointing in completely different directions. And that's the part that lingers, because when legal battles start revealing as much as they attempt to conceal, the question quietly changes from who is right to something far more unsettling. How much of this story has always existed just out of view? What if the moment everything turned wasn't loud or explosive, but buried inside paperwork that was never supposed to see daylight? Once the attempt to seal those settlement documents failed, the tone of the entire situation shifted, because now, whether anyone liked it or not, fragments of this story were no longer speculation. They were part of the public record. On March 11, 2026, Kim Kardashian submitted a sworn declaration, firmly denying that any planning had taken place, describing Ray J's version as completely untrue. The same day, Kris Jenner filed her own statement, calling the accusations deeply offensive, drawing a clear line between their position and everything being alleged. But just 2 days later, the tone shifted again when Ray J's legal team responded, not by softening their stance, but by directly accusing both of them of being untruthful under oath, a claim that instantly raised the stakes in a way that couldn't be easily walked back. And then came the detail that made people pause mid-sentence. Stephen Hirsch, the executive connected to Vivid Entertainment, was reportedly willing to testify in open court. That possibility alone changed how people looked at everything, because it introduced the idea that someone from inside the original distribution process might present a version that either aligns or directly conflicts with what has already been stated under oath. According to reporting from TMZ, the situation raises a quiet but critical question about consent and authorization, one that has always existed in the background but is now being pulled into focus. And here's where the tension becomes less about headlines and more about consequences, because this isn't just reputational anymore. Kim has been publicly pursuing a legal career path, working toward the California bar. And while none of these claims have been proven in court, the mere presence of conflicting sworn statements creates a cloud that's difficult to ignore. It introduces a possibility, not a conclusion, but a possibility that the outcome of this case could ripple far beyond the original dispute. But the story doesn't stay contained within legal filings for long, because when people began stepping back and looking at a broader timeline, a different conversation started forming online. Across discussions and viral clips, some began pointing to what they interpret as a recurring pattern in how Kris navigates opportunities involving her daughters, decisions that, depending on perspective, either reflect sharp business instincts or something more self-serving. One example frequently mentioned is a reported October 2025 deal involving MAC Cosmetics, a move that caught attention because of its overlap with existing family brands, raising questions about alignment and communication behind the scenes. Then, in November 2025, during a podcast with Jay Shetty, Kris openly discussed maintaining close relationships with her daughter's former partners, describing it as emotional connection, but to some listeners, it introduced a different kind of curiosity, because depending on how you interpret those choices, it either paints a picture of someone who keeps people close or someone who never really lets them leave. And once that idea settles in, it becomes harder to look at the rest of this story the same way again. What if the line between family and strategy isn't as clear as it looks from the outside, and the difference only becomes visible when you start asking why certain connections never fully fade? The question around Kris Jenner maintaining close relationships with her daughter's former partners doesn't land the same for everyone. Some see loyalty, others see something more calculated. But either way, it creates a kind of access that never really disappears. That ambiguity deepens when you look at reports from February 2026, where outlets like Radar Online claimed she was encouraging Kylie Jenner to take a major personal step with Timothée Chalamet, not necessarily based on timing or readiness, but on the long-term image it could create. Even the small details, social media interactions, subtle public acknowledgments start to feel less so shiny and more like pieces being arranged before the full picture is revealed. And that's where the tone quietly shifts, because what might look like support on the surface can also be interpreted as positioning, depending on how you choose to read it. Then almost abruptly, the focus moves to April 2026, where a different kind of conversation begins circulating, this time involving Kim Kardashian and her daughter North West at Coachella. The setting alone raised eyebrows for some observers, but it was the surrounding moments that kept the discussion alive. Appearances alongside Lewis Hamilton, reactions from artists like Young Thug, and clips circulating online that sparked questions about exposure, awareness, and timing. None of these details prove anything on their own, but together they form a sequence that people keep revisiting, trying to understand what it represents. Because when a public figure's child begins appearing more frequently in high visibility environments, music videos, performances, social media, the conversation naturally shifts from moments to patterns. And whether those patterns are intentional or simply a byproduct of fame depends entirely on perspective, which is exactly why the debate doesn't settle. But everything takes on a different weight when you bring Kanye West back into the timeline, not as a headline, but as someone who had a front row seat to years of decisions the public only saw in fragments. For a long time, his statements were dismissed as chaotic or exaggerated, and to be fair, some of them were difficult to interpret at face value. Yet when you isolate the moment specifically involving his children and Kris Jenner, the tone becomes noticeably more focused, almost methodical. In 2020, before the divorce filings, he publicly pushed back against certain directions being suggested for his family, even referencing past decisions he claimed to have intervened in. Years later, in March 2025, he posted statements expressing deep concern about his children's environment, framing it not as speculation, but as something he felt compelled to investigate. He even shared messages suggesting he had been in contact with an independent investigator, someone he believed was outside the influence of the Kardashian circle. Maybe it was precaution, maybe it was overreaction, or maybe it was something else entirely. But once those pieces are placed alongside everything else, the narrative stops feeling isolated. Instead, it starts to resemble a series of moments that might be connected in ways people are only beginning to question. And the more those questions linger, the harder it becomes to decide which parts of this story were ever as simple as they first appeared. What if the moment that seemed the most unbelievable was actually the one backed by the most structure behind the scenes? When Kanye West responded to the noise surrounding his claims, it didn't come in the form of another late-night post. It traced back to something far more deliberate. In October 2024, a lawsuit filed in Los Angeles by a former Yeezy staffer revealed a role that didn't sound like fashion or music at all: Director of Intelligence. According to that filing, the assignment wasn't symbolic. It involved looking into alleged connections tied to the Kardashian circle, with the individual reportedly bringing prior military intelligence experience into the task. That detail alone reframes the situation because it suggests planning, funding, and intent rather than impulse. And just when it seemed like that thread might fade, April 2026 reports from Yahoo Celebrity indicated Kanye was still publicly aligning himself with Ray J's claims, signaling that whatever he believed hadn't shifted with time. But here's where the tension sharpens, because while one side is doubling down, the response from Kris Jenner took a different tone entirely. On March 3rd, 2026, statements attributed to her described a permanent break in trust, emphasizing that forgiveness was off the table, regardless of any apology. It's a reaction that, depending on how you interpret it, either reflects personal boundaries or sidesteps the substance of what's being said. And that contrast between allegation and response creates a gap that keeps pulling people back in. Then the story expands beyond individuals and into something broader, almost impossible to map in a straight line. In December 2025, the U.S. Department of Justice began releasing large volumes of files connected to Jeffrey Epstein, triggering a wave of online analysis that moved faster than anyone could fully process. Around the same time, discussions about Kris Jenner and Ray J were already gaining traction, and on platforms like TikTok and Reddit, those two timelines started appearing side by side, not as proof, not as confirmation, but as proximity, which is often enough to spark theories that take on a life of their own. One moment that kept resurfacing was Kris Jenner's November 8, 2025 birthday event, reportedly hosted at a Beverly Hills property associated with Jeff Bezos. The guest list read like a cross-section of global influence: Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, Oprah Winfrey, Tyler Perry, Beyonce, Paris Hilton, with Bruno Mars reportedly performing. None of that is unusual on its own for that level of celebrity, yet the timing, so close to renewed attention on Epstein-related material, became the detail people couldn't stop circling back to, because when unrelated events align in close proximity, even coincidence starts to feel like something people want to decode. And just when it seems like the narrative couldn't stretch any further, another name quietly re-enters the frame: Corey Gamble, the same figure seen sitting silently during that earlier confrontation, present but rarely explained. Kanye has, on multiple occasions, made claims about Corey's background, suggesting roles that go far beyond what's publicly known. But those statements remain unverified and widely debated. What isn't debated, though, is how little concrete information exists about his professional life, despite appearing consistently alongside some of the most visible figures in entertainment. No clear business profile, no widely recognized enterprise, just a presence that seems to move through high-level spaces without leaving obvious traces. And that absence of clarity doesn't prove anything, but it does create a vacuum. And in that vacuum, questions tend to grow louder, because in a story already filled with overlapping timelines, conflicting accounts, and shifting narratives, sometimes it's not the loudest claims that stay with people. It's the details no one can fully explain. And just as that realization starts to settle in, another name begins to surface, one that pulls this entire conversation into an even more complicated direction. What if the name that keeps appearing on the edges of multiple high-profile situations isn't there by coincidence, but because it quietly connects more pieces than anyone expected? As conversations continued to spiral, another figure began surfacing in online discussions: Lou Taylor, a business manager whose past associations have repeatedly placed her near some of the most controversial moments in celebrity culture. At first, it doesn't seem unusual. Powerful figures often share the same advisors, the same legal circles, the same financial strategists. But the deeper people looked, the more her name appeared in contexts that raised eyebrows, particularly her widely discussed connection to Britney Spears during the years of her conservatorship. That alone wouldn't automatically mean anything here, but it introduces a pattern that some observers find difficult to ignore, one where control, influence, and decision-making structures become central themes. And once that idea is planted, it starts to echo back into everything else we've just explored, creating a strange sense that these stories might not be as isolated as they seem. What makes this even more unsettling is how quietly these connections exist. Never front and center, never fully explained, but always just visible enough for people to notice if they're paying attention. Because when the same names begin appearing across different narratives involving power, media, and control, it doesn't automatically confirm anything. But it does make the situation feel more layered than a typical celebrity dispute. Some online discussions have even speculated about overlapping networks of management and influence operating behind the scenes, not as a coordinated conspiracy, but as a system where the same key players move between high-stakes environments. That idea alone changes how people interpret everything else, including the legal battles, the public statements, and even the personal relationships we've been examining. And while none of this provides clear answers, it does something arguably more powerful. It reframes the entire story as something still unfolding, something not yet fully understood. Because if these connections are meaningful, then we're only seeing fragments of a much larger picture. And if they're not, then why do they keep showing up in the same places, at the same moments, tied to the same kind of questions? What if the most unsettling part of this entire story isn't any single claim, but how many different threads seem to echo the same underlying idea? The name Lou Taylor keeps resurfacing in conversations that, on the surface, shouldn't be connected, particularly because of her past association with Britney Spears during the years of her conservatorship. That period alone remains one of the most publicly dissected legal situations in modern celebrity culture. And while there's no confirmed overlap with the Kardashian narrative, Her presence at Kris Jenner's high-profile birthday gathering didn't go unnoticed by people already looking for patterns. Some online discussions have gone further, speculating about financial links or shared networks, though it's important to note that these ideas remain unproven and largely driven by interpretation rather than documented evidence. Still, when the same names appear in multiple high-stakes environments involving control, influence, and money, it creates a kind of tension that's difficult to ignore completely. And just when it seems like the speculation couldn't stretch any further, another layer quietly enters the conversation. A complaint connected to the case of Ghislaine Maxwell has been cited in online discussions, mentioning the Kardashian sisters not in confirmed wrongdoing, but in an allegation tied to identity misuse without supporting documentation presented so far. The claim exists within public records, but remains unverified, sitting in that uncomfortable space between presence and proof. And yet, it's exactly that kind of detail that keeps the conversation alive because it adds weight without resolution. Over the years, Kanye West has repeatedly drawn comparisons between Kris Jenner and figures like Maxwell, framing his concerns around influence, access, and the environment surrounding his children. Ray J, in his own way, has expressed concerns that echo a similar tone, while former employees have added their own perspectives through legal filings. None of these pieces on their own confirm a larger narrative, but together they form a pattern that people keep returning to, trying to understand whether it's coincidence or something more structured beneath the surface. And that's where this story leaves us, not with clear answers, but with a growing collection of overlapping claims, denials, timelines, and unanswered questions. The release of extensive files tied to Jeffrey Epstein only intensified that curiosity, giving people more information to sift through while drawing their own connections. Fairly or not, maybe these threads are unrelated, loosely tied together by timing and public fascination, or maybe they hint at something more complex, operating quietly in the background. Either way, the narrative no longer feels simple, and it no longer fits neatly into a single explanation. Because when multiple voices, some credible, some controversial, begin pointing in similar directions, even without proof, it creates a kind of gravity that pulls attention back again and again. And now, with legal battles still unfolding and more details potentially on the horizon, the real question isn't just what happened, but what might still come out next. Comment below with what you think is really going on. Leave a like if this gave you chills, and subscribe, plus turn on notifications if you want to see more Hollywood secrets.